Well, good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with all of you and welcome you to this special book event. I have the privilege this evening of introducing professor, journalist, author Rachel Swarns and her recent book, The 272, The Families Who Were Enslaved and Sold to Build the American Catholic Church. She presents a history shaped by the stories told over generations by the descendants enslaved on Jesuit plantations, a book deeply grounded in historical archives and research, a work which deepens our understanding of the Catholic Church and the early history of our nation. We honor the descendants of the enslaved whose families are central to this history, and we are grateful for the ways their presence and their engagement is helping to shape our community today. I would like to thank Dr. Adam Rothman, professor in the Department of History and founding director of the Center for the Study of Slavery and Its Legacies here at Georgetown, and his colleagues for their important work to deepen our understanding and engagement with this history. We're grateful for your contributions and for your efforts to gather us together this afternoon. For more than 3 decades, Rachel Swarns has worked as a journalist, reporting on a broad range of national and international issues, including race relations, and the legacies of America's original sin. In 1995, she joined the New York Times as a reporter and correspondent, continuing her work as a contributing writer. She now serves as a journalism professor at New York University. Her first book, published in 2012, American Tapestry, the story of the Black, white, and multiracial ancestors of Michelle Obama, traces 5 generations of Mrs. Obama's ancestors from slavery to the White House. She also co-authored Unseen, Unpublished Black History from the New York Times Photo Archives, a collection of 175 photos from meaningful moments in Black history. The 272, published this summer, tells the story of the Mahoney family, from enslavement and forced labor to freedom, a powerful testament to their strength and endurance, the challenges they faced and overcame. It is a moving reflection on the central role of slavery and enslaved people in our emerging nation and in the Catholic Church. In her words, this is a book, and I quote, about family and holding on to family, even in the harshest of circumstances. It is a story of heartbreak, but is also a story about love, resistance, and the irrepressible hunger for liberty. Close quote. In our community, we have sought to engage this history to understand it as a part of our university's story. In February 2016, Professor Rothman and members of our working group on slavery, memory, and reconciliation established the Georgetown Slavery Archive as a digital home for materials related to Jesuit slaveholding and slaveholding at Georgetown. A few months later, in April 2016, Rachel shared the story of the descendants on the front page of the New York Times, reaching millions of readers and hundreds of descendants whose ancestors had been enslaved on Jesuit plantations and who began to understand their connection to this history. We're profoundly grateful for the leadership of the descendant community, the work of scholars and researchers, the ongoing engagement across our Georgetown community as we seek to understand and reconcile this painful history. I want to thank you all for your presence here this evening, and it's now my honor to turn this over to Adam Rothman and Rachel Swarns for tonight's conversation. Adam.
President DeGioia, thank you for that introduction. Rachel and I will have a conversation for the first part of this evening, And then we'll turn it over to you for questions in the second part. So stay alert, think of some questions, especially students in the audience. We want to hear from you. Rachel, welcome to Georgetown. It's wonderful to have you here.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Sorry, go ahead. Didn't mean to interrupt you. For us, this is the continuation of a conversation that's been going on for 7 years now. And for my part, I can date it back to an email I received with the subject line, question from the New York Times. So if you get an email like that, you should definitely open it. It might change your life. Did mine. I think most people here are probably familiar with your incredible 2016 article and the national and even international sensation it made, spreading the story about the GU-272 across continents. My first question is that you could have stopped there. As we say, Passover, my people, Dayenu, would have been enough. You could have stopped there and said, my work is done, and moved on to the next story. But why did you decide to continue, to turn the article into a book? What more did you want to learn and say about this history?
It's such a great question, and first of all, I want to say I'm so thrilled to be here, where so much of this journey started for me. And thank you, President DeGioia, and all of you for being here. I think it might be interesting to tell you a little bit about how I got started in the first place, because truly it happened almost entirely by accident. A colleague of mine at the New York Times got an email from a Georgetown alum who was pitching a story about an 1838 slave sale that benefited Georgetown. I was still a full-time correspondent at the Times. And she gets this email and she's intrigued, but she's also kind of like uncertain, like, is a 19th century slave sale even news? Like, what to do with that? And you have to remember, this was January of 2016, so it was before the 1619 Project. Ta-Nehisi Coates had written his powerful case for reparations, but in the Atlantic, but mostly newspapers wrote about the here and now, as we still largely do. So I always say it's my great fortune that she didn't just delete the email. And she didn't because she remembered that maybe there is someone who might know if this is a story. She remembered my book about Michelle Obama's enslaved ancestors. And so she forwarded the email to me, and I knew immediately that it was a story. My book about Michelle Obama's ancestors allowed me to explore how slavery shaped American families. And I could see that this would allow me to do what seemed to me like the next step, explore how slavery shaped American institution, an important elite American institution, Georgetown. I wasn't sure, of course, it felt urgent to me in a way that maybe it wasn't to my editors, but it felt urgent to me because it felt like it was so foundational, like it said so much about who we are as a country living with this. But I wasn't sure kind of how it would resonate. The story appeared, it did resonate, and I was able to persuade my editors that this wasn't just a one-off, that really it was a line of reporting. Like I should continue writing about Georgetown and about other institutions. And as I kept digging, I started realizing, wait, this isn't just Georgetown. This is the Catholic Church itself. And I started to think about the questions I had asked myself initially when I first heard about it. Catholic priests enslaved people? Catholic priests bought and sold people? I happen to be Black and Catholic myself, and I had no idea. Of course, historians knew about the history of Catholic slaveholding, but their stories had been largely left out of the origin story of the Catholic Church, and I wanted to know more about the priests and more about the families.
Yeah. Were you at all surprised by how much the story resonated when it came out? You had a sense that this was an urgent and important story, but did you know that so many other people would think so too?
No, no. You don't. I felt again, but I was so personally interested in kind of exploring how slavery and its legacies live with us that like it was urgent to me. But I don't think any of us really knew what kind of reach it might have.
Yeah. So I'm interested that part of your interest in this history was its connection to major American institutions, institutions of higher education like Georgetown, the Catholic Church. But in a way, the book explores that. But the book also decenters the church and Georgetown in a way because it is really about a family. And that was true of the article in the Times as well. But the article in the Times was about a different family in the GU 272,
right.
The Maryland Jesuit enslaved community. So I want to ask you why you shifted your focus and decided to concentrate on this extraordinary family, the Mahonies. And I have to pause here because I think we have some Mahoney descendants in the audience. And I just want to give them a shout out, say hello. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being here today. It means a lot. So why the Mahonies?
So when you're writing about and researching slavery, if you're a journalist anyway, you're aware that there's a segment of folks who are going to immediately say, no, thank you, not interested, long time ago, nothing to do with me. And so how do you engage an audience with the ideas and with the story? And I thought 272 people were sold, scores of families. I would focus on one. To tell you just briefly about the Mahonies, their experience parallels the emergence of Catholicism in the British colonies and in the early United States and the church's reliance on slavery. And I start with the matriarch, a Black woman by the name of Anne Joyce, who arrives in Maryland in the late 1600s as an indentured servant. And we all know something about indentured servants, Europeans mostly, who came with a contract and a term of years to work and then to go on their way. And that was certainly her hope. But she arrived at a time when the economy was transitioning from one that relied on indentured labor to one that relied on enslaved labor. Her contract is burned, she's forced into slavery, and she loses everything, except for her story. And she tells that story to everyone who will listen. The white people around her, her children and grandchildren, her descendants, they tell the story. And it's a simple story. Our liberty was stolen and we should be free people. And her descendants resist. She has descendants who kill an overseer and are executed. She has descendants who take the Jesuits to court, file lawsuits to try and secure their freedom. Only a few manage to do that. So she has a descendant, Harry Mahoney, who in the War of 1812 saves the church's money at St. Inigo's plantation, and for his courage and loyalty is rewarded with a promise that neither he nor his children would ever be sold, and that promise is broken in 1838. And so it's a powerful story, but the truth is there are countless powerful stories, and the reason why I focused on them, aside from what I described for you, is really simple. It's the records. It's what I could find. If you're writing about enslaved people, you know that is an enormous, enormous challenge.
Yeah, it's an incredible sweep of history that you cover through the story of this family it must be 10 or 12 generations of history, which is just extraordinary, I think, for any family, but certainly especially extraordinary for a family that was enslaved for multiple generations. The degree of difficulty of this history is really high. And so I want you to help us understand how you actually reconstruct the history of this family through the sources that we have at our disposal. But I want to read something to everybody here from the 272 that I thought this was really powerful. You're writing here specifically about the Mahoney sisters who are separated by the 1838 sale. And that is a really important part of this history in a whole variety of ways. But you write, sometimes as I studied the spidery script of the Jesuits' handwritten letters, the sisters and their ancestors seemed like ghosts passing through this world, leaving barely a trace. That's an amazing reflection on the nature of the sources and the research. So I want to ask you more about those traces that they did leave. So where did you find the enslaved Mahoneys in the historical record? What are the sources that you use to try to tell their story? And when the sources don't reveal enough, what do you do? What's your strategy for filling in those gaps?
Yes, so if you're writing about the enslaved, it's just, it's challenging. So many of you know probably that by law and by practice, enslaved people are often barred from learning to read or write. And so letters, journals are, super hard to come by. There are a number of sources that I used, and you're kind of weaving together these tiny threads of information. I mentioned the lawsuits. Those were really important documents because they still exist, and they were filed in the late 1700s, but people alive remembered the stories of Anne Joyce. One of her grandchildren or great-grandchildren was interviewed. So those were, so it actually had voices of people who could talk about her and describe her. So those were important records. The Jesuits, of course, kept a trove of records, which were really important sources. It's hard to wrap your mind around, but if you're writing about enslaved people, you're writing about essentially property. So you're looking at property records. That's how people were viewed. So you're looking at tax records. You're looking at inventories, mortgages, those kinds of things. Also, the letters from the priests who wrote about members of the family. The descendants and, Anne Joyce herself, her story, the determination to keep that story, that oral history, and I know that historians have mixed feelings about oral histories, but I think that was a really important thing, too, and that story survived well into the 20th century. And there were priests, too, because the two sisters that I write about, Louisa and Anna, one remains in Maryland, the other ends up in Louisiana, and Louisa lives a long time. She lives until the early 1900s, and 20th century priests write about her and describe things that she said to them. So it's kind of all of those things. And there are so many holes and questions. Sometimes I filled those with people, similarly situated people. I would tell the story of a family that was torn apart from a narrative, a slave narrative from someone who was a Maryland, enslaved in Maryland, and who had that experience, to share that experience from that person's vantage point. And then I think, honestly, sometimes, the absence speaks itself. It speaks to the marginalization. It speaks to how, Black people were treated by the archive in itself and by the people around them who didn't, take note. And so I think that's an important, there are questions that you grapple with, but that in and of itself is an important thing to point out.
Yeah. That's a remarkable discussion of how you work with such fragmentary materials. But then there are these like flashes of presence in the archive. You have at one point where you're talking about Harry Mahoney during the War of 1812, and I think you say that he wore a size 10 and a half shoe.
Because there is, the art. It's amazing. Like doing this kind of work is kind of like. So I love mysteries, right? So I like bad ones too, right? I do, not just a literary one. So part of it is just the hunt, right? Like you're searching for these. You're searching for this information. You're trying to find the families in the archive. So. Sometimes there's so many things you can't find, but there are sometimes it's just like, oh my goodness, and there is a document, it's on your archive, the shoes. I think it may be Moberly who collected the shoe sizes of people at St. Inigo's at one point.
Yeah. Remarkable document. Going back to the oral history and the court cases, I think one of the interesting things about the freedom suits from the late 1700s and early 1800s is that they actually provide written evidence of the oral history that was passed down from generation to generation from Anne Joyce to her children and grandchildren. Could you help us understand what the claim was in the freedom suits based on that testimony? Like, what were the grounds on which Anne Joyce's descendants were claiming that they should be free?
That she was a free person, that she came as a free person, that she had a contract just like any other indentured servant at the time, and that contract was forcibly broken, that she was a free person and, slavery descended through the mother, and they should be free people.
Well, okay, so they're using that principle of matrilineal descent, which is usually used to enslave people,
right,
to assert their own freedom. So I think that's an amazing, there are lots of things that are amazing about the freedom suits, but just the way that they preserve that oral history is, at least for historians, one of their most valuable elements. As you're doing the research, did you come across things, what surprised you the most?
I guess one of the things that was most surprising was that so many of the families remain Catholic. When you talk about records, I should have mentioned that sacramental records end up being a really important guidepost for genealogists and family members and researchers who are studying these families. And after the Civil War, when people had a choice about where they would worship and, where their spiritual home would be, so many of these families looked at the church that had betrayed them and decided to stay. And it wasn't that everyone decided to stay, because thousands of people left the Catholic Church, which after the Civil War, it was a segregated church. I mean, there was, seating. White people received communion first. Festivities were segregated. In New Orleans, thousands of people left. But many of these families stayed and became lay leaders in the church, some even religious leaders in the church, and worked to make the church more responsive to and reflective of Black Catholics, and true to the church's own ideals of universality. And as a Black Catholic myself, I found that really inspiring.
That's extremely powerful. Can you imagine or reflect on the power of faith for enslaved Catholics themselves, even as they're being sold by the priests who own them? They still have faith. So how?
It's a mystery. It's really interesting. I mean, if you look at, there are, if in the 1700s, for instance, and there are other scholars who have looked more closely at this than I have, but, the priests required people, to go to Mass and participate in the sacraments to some degree. Some people enslaved by the Jesuits never embraced Catholicism. Some people embraced a kind of, a combination, because the West African deities and the saints there is that kind of, in the Caribbean it's very similar, that kind of way of merging and fusing similar faiths in a way. But some people really did, and you can see, in the sacramental records in terms of the baptisms and the marriages. And as I mentioned, there are a number of folks who become nuns, for instance, and open schools. And I like to think that they said that the church didn't belong to those sinful men. It didn't. And that they would reshape it in a way that reflected their faith and their beliefs.
Let's turn that around for a moment. And one of the things that always strikes me about the records is that you can find the same names of enslaved people in the baptismal records as you can find in the bills of sale. Mm-hmm. So the Jesuits are baptizing the people they own one day and selling them the next. So same question, how? How do they do that? How do they rationalize the 1838 sale?
Yeah, it's such a good question. And, if you look at these documents, on the one hand, the priests were unlike some white people who viewed enslaved people as like brutes or animals. The priests believed that they had souls, that they were human beings with souls, souls that needed to be nurtured, and that the priests had an obligation to nurture those souls. At the same time, though, there was no prohibition from Rome on the buying and selling of Black bodies at this time. And so they could, on the one hand, be very, very interested in making sure that people could go to church and go to Mass. And at the same time, it's not just 1838 either, right? There are slave sales that happen all throughout this history. John Carroll in the early 1800s, talking about the plantations and some of the debts and how to deal with that, talks about the sale of a few unnecessary Negroes. And that's just... Thomas Milady in the 1830s has a vision. And he looks around and says, the Catholic Church that is rooted in this rural plantation system, that's not the future. The future is up north. He's looking at the waves of immigrants pouring into the cities, Catholic immigrants, and says, that's the future. We need to position ourselves to do that. Georgetown is struggling, the prize mission project of the Jesuits. The Jesuits themselves are struggling financially. He's got this dream, and the only way to do it is to sell these people. I always say, though, that it's also really important to know that all along the way, there are priests who raise questions, who raise concerns, and who even protest some of what is going on. And a counterpoint to Milady is a priest by the name of Father Joseph Carberry, who has a very different perspective of the enslaved people that he finds himself in charge of at St. Inigo's. He sees people with capacity. He sees people with faith. He writes a letter about a guy, an enslaved man who builds a windmill and marvels at the craftsmanship. He sets up an experiment on his plantation because the Jesuits are always complaining about the plantations not producing. He thinks maybe if we paid some people, you know?
Oh,
and so,
idea.
what an idea. And so he carves it up and says, families, have your acres, you produce, you grow how you see fit, we'll share the produce and you will share in the profits. And when an Irish senior Jesuit who had been to St. Inigo's in the 1820s comes in the 1830s, he marvels at the change. And Carberry, when he heard about the sale, had everyone praying that it wouldn't happen. When it seemed like prayers weren't going to do it, he went to Georgetown and expressed his opposition in person. And when it was clear that wasn't going to work, when the slave traders came, he told people to run. So I think it's important because there are folks who will also say, if you are writing about or researching slavery, don't bring your 21st century moral judgments to this history. It was legal, that was another time. And it was legal, and that was another time. But priests were wrestling with these questions in the moment, and it's important to know that. Lonely voices, but important ones.
Yeah, a voice of conscience.
Yeah.
Could you just briefly touch on Carberry's relationship to Louisa Mahoney, one of the sisters that we talked about earlier, who's an important part of the book and the history?
So everybody's complicated, right? And actually Carberry is complicated too. So for a while, I was like, Carberry, he's my guy, which, he did these, for his time. And he was close to the Mahonies. The Mahonies worked in the manor house, the women did, and so two things are interesting about him. One is that Louisa gathers her mother and runs and goes to the woods and manages to escape. Her sister Anna, with 2 young children, does not. She comes back, and she's welcomed back into slavery, right? Where she remains until the 1860s. And for a while, I just was like, but of course he's a middle manager in a way. I don't know that he would have had the power to free her, but for a while that got me. But what he did do was when the buyer came back to try and collect the people who hadn't gotten swept up in that wave of that shipment, he bought her back. He said it paid for her to stay at the plantation with her parents.
So what you also get there is that the Maryland Jesuit enslaved community is essentially split or divided in many ways by the 1838 sale. But many people end up in Louisiana, but some people stay in Maryland, like Louisa and her children and descendants. And one of the remarkable things about your work, your historical research, is that it tracks both sides of, both fates across time. And I just say, historiographically, the way historians have written about slavery and the slave trade, this is something that's quite new. It's been very difficult, virtually impossible, to track families and communities over time that were divided by the domestic slave trade. but the 272 and the story of, and their history is showing us how to do that. So it's extremely important for so many reasons, and that's just one of them. I want to get back to that in a minute, but let's just put the history aside for a moment and talk a little bit about writing. You wrote at least some of this book during COVID, and I know there's probably a lot of aspiring writers in the audience, some actual writers as well. Could you tell us a little bit about your writing process? Like, how do you sit down and write, especially a history as difficult as this?
So COVID, I used to joke with people and say, "Oh goodness, when I go and talk about the book, I'm not going to talk about the Jesuits and the families and Georgetown. I'm going to talk about Zoom school. That's what I'm going to talk about." So it was so difficult because I was, in fact, that was the time that I had planned to do the writing of it, and I have children, and so there were times when truly I wasn't sure. I joke that it's a miracle that it's done. I prayed. I joke that it's a miracle, but truly, I mean, I was up at 4 a.m. I just said, okay, if I can write 100 words a day, 100 words, Zoom school with my son, then Zoom school with my students at NYU, and then my husband and other son, and then start all over again. In terms of the writing, I felt like someone gave me really good advice because my head for a long time was stuck, understandably, in 1838 because that's where it started for me. And an editor that I know said, okay, for your first draft, just start from the beginning. Just write everything you've got from the beginning. Don't worry too much about, what it looks like. Just start from the beginning. And it was kind of like this amazing thing because I realized then, if I start from the beginning, I'm starting in 1634 when the first Jesuits arrived. And it kind of just opened things up for me in my head about how to tell the story. But in terms of process, which I'm so like crazily interested in, like way more than we could have time for today, I did that. I wrote that kind of just a draft of like from beginning to end. And I am a fan of just writing every single day, like no matter what, every single day. And then once I had that draft, and you're finding holes and doing reporting and finding holes, but then that's the best part. Then you can kind of rip it up and say, okay, went down this rabbit hole with Henry Johnson. No one really needs to know as much as I know about him. Let me kind of whittle that down. So I thought it would take 2 years. It took 7, but yeah.
A little bit different from the journalistic
Yes.
deadline. Yeah. So I'm going to take those pieces of advice. Start at the beginning and write every day.
Every day.
I'm going to try to do that. I have one final question, and then we'll open it up to all of you for your questions. So my question is about the significance of the emergence of the descendant community of the GU 272. Your New York Times article really accelerated that community discovery, self-discovery. And certainly those of us here at Georgetown, my experience as a historian has been completely enriched by meeting descendants, hearing the stories about their families, their family histories. So I wanted to ask you what you think the significance and impact of the emergence of the GU 272 descendant community has been, both for how you write this history, but also more generally.
I think it's the thing, like, of course, there's so much there's so much that has happened that I never would have expected after that first article. But I think the emergence of the descendant community is and the impact of that is again, something I never would have imagined. We certainly knew when I had written the first story, only Richard Cellini and his group, the Georgetown Memory Project, an independent nonprofit, had identified about a handful of people. We knew that there were probably more. So along with the main piece, we ran a kind of companion piece asking people, do you recognize these names? We had a link to the passenger manifest of the Catherine Jackson, which carried people to Louisiana, which had first and last names. Scores of people wrote to us and to you, too. And I always say that, people say, oh gosh, what is it like, telling people this? And I say, and how do people respond? And I say, oh, it's so interesting. People weep, people raged, and they organized, right? Organized, pressing Georgetown, pressing the Jesuits to really address this history and to take concrete steps to address this history. And I think as of today, there are more than 6,000 descendants who have been identified. And one of the things that is so, I think, important and moving to me is that these families who were torn apart by this sale and by others before it are now doing the work of bringing, reuniting, of bringing themselves back together again. And that's amazing. Zoom calls over kitchen tables, restaurants, at this amazing reunion that you attended in Maryland over Labor Day, reunions in Louisiana years before. They are reuniting those families that were torn apart.
Thank you. You and I could probably talk for another 7 years.
Forever.
But let's open it up to the audience for questions. I especially implore students. Let's hear from you. There are microphones going around, so I see a hand here.
I've been fascinated by the Catholic history of Southern Maryland for more than 30 years. I've been familiar with the story of Father Carberry, or part of his story, for more than 30 years. But until you wrote about it, I didn't know this part of his story. But I've got a very specific and concrete question. Down there at the very tip of St. Mary's County, down practically to Point Lookout, is the little village of St. Inigo's, and the church, which I think Father Carberry built or rebuilt around the time of the War of 1812. But the manor house that's so important to the history of the Catholic Church in Maryland and really in the country, that's so important to Jesuit history, it's my understanding that not a stone remains, and I think that it's on the grounds of that naval installation down there. And I just wonder if you've been to the place, if there is anything left.
So I don't know. I think there was a fire, but I don't know.
So you yourself, you didn't get access to the naval installation that's there
No.
and find that site?
No.
I have been there.
You have been.
There is still the remains of the manor house. It's in ruins. I would add that there's an archaeological project going on at St. Inigo's on the Patuxent Naval Base. Laura Mazer at Catholic University has done some wonderful archaeological work in partnership with members of the descendant community down there. So it's an interesting place. Yeah. I see a question here.
Do you feel that the division in the Jesuit community is a reflection of the amount of contact that the Jesuits had with the enslaved community, whereas the plantation priest was against the sale, whereas the administration at the university was remote to the slave community and promoted the sale?
That's an interesting question. I don't know. It could be. Certainly, and Joseph Carberry wasn't the only one who opposed. Some of the other managers, like Peter Havermans and Thomas Lilly, also raised concerns, and they were people who worked quite closely, with enslaved people. Could be.
Go ahead, in the middle.
Yes, good evening. I'm Dr. William Wander, and I want to thank you because your research is right on. I'm not sure.
It doesn't seem like it's on.
Good evening. I'm Roland Quander, and what I wanted to say is I won't call it unintended consequence. I will say the extent of your writing, and I brought my book for you to autograph, has created a quote unquote a monster, because the Smithsonian Museum of African American History and Culture, joining in with the historic preservation, has expanded itself looking at sites where people went, and what they did when they got there, and why those sites should be preserved. And in our own Quander family, we wondered about some of our ancestors, and because of your research, it opened our eyes to look into another line of research, and we discovered that several of our relatives were sold not in the 272, but were sold south by Maryland Catholics, the Culverts and the Carrolls, not through Georgetown, but separately. And we are now in an active project looking for our relatives who were sold south, Quander's surname, who were connected and related to the Mahoneys, as you know already. And so we are looking for a whole new group of people that some of them may not even know they're Quander and Mahoney descendants because they've been down there more than 200 years. In some cases. So I want to thank you for because you have lit a fire in corners that the unanticipated consequence, and like you and the book, Francis Scott Key was our attorney too. Okay.
That's right.
Rachel, could you talk a little bit about the inspiration that your New York Times story and the book has for people doing genealogy, especially Black family history?
I think that, I always like to say to people that truly, in addition to my, mysteries and detective things, what I really want to do is kind of preach the gospel of genealogy, because it's so important for people to know family history. And I feel like, again, it's one of those things that feels urgent to me, that everyone, when you leave this room, talk to your eldest relative now. But yeah, for a lot of families, it has been, people, are always asking about, this bit of information or that bit of information. And I think that also the slavery archive too, just surfacing a lot of these records, making them easily accessible to people, has really inspired a lot of people to be able to kind of, connect, the dots in some of these cases.
Go ahead.
Hi, thank you for coming today. I was curious that you mentioned earlier about how the Catholic religion by those who've been enslaved still has been adopted by them. And so I was curious, what are some of the ways that the Catholic religion had been adopted and changed to kind of make it work for them as opposed to against them?
So there were members of the Mahoney family, for instance, that got involved with, establishing Black parishes, Black churches in New Orleans, for instance. They set up schools, Sunday schools, educational programs. So in those ways, there was even a Mother Superior who actually established an overseas mission, to minister to Black folks in the Caribbean. So those are some of the ways.
Since I have the mic, hello, I'm Julie Hawkins-Ennis. Hello, Adam. Hello, Rachel. First, I want to, I was part of the committee that organized the Labor Day event for all of the descendants, And this is the row of all the descendants here, the Mahoney descendants and the Macy descendants. Check. Okay. I'm a singer, can you tell? And of course, I'm a connection. A lot of us in Southern Maryland, I am from Southern Maryland. I grew up in St. Mary's County. I am a Black Catholic. We have remained Catholic, like Rachel has said. But I want to thank you, Adam, for coming to our event. Rachel, your book was so important to actually reaching out to the descendants. And, I know when we found out it's a complicated history, and trying to explain it to people was complicated. But your book, I always recommended the book to people who were coming to the event. And that just made it so much more of an understanding for people of what took place with these families and the ones that were sold away. I'm from Southern Maryland, and I think I wrote you and I said, you were talking about things that only us from Southern Maryland knew about. And she knew all the little, the nuances. And I always used to say to Henrietta, unless you're from, I call it home, there's a lot of little things that you really have to research to find out about. And you did that in your book. So thank you so much. It made our gathering actually a wonderful event. I can't even explain how we all felt. We did hear, for me, people from Louisiana came to me and said that it was just an amazing experience. They were coming back home to their ancestral lands, and I didn't think of it that way. And we were split apart, and we came together after 200 years. So thank you, and thank you, Adam.
Miles, go ahead.
Hello, Professor. Hello there, Rachel.
Also, Professor.
Yeah.
Yep.
Hi, Rachel.
So I'm Miles. I'm a history graduate student here at Georgetown. I wanted to ask you what the archival process is like as part of your research. So besides the Georgetown Slavery Archive, which Professor Rothman here put together, what other archival resources did you use? What challenges arose in analyzing documents? And how did the oral accounts from descendants here help bring agency to the GU 272?
It's a good question. The archives, so the digital archive is awesome. And actually, Georgetown has been just steadily digitizing just the library itself, more of these documents, which is really important because it makes it more widely available. The records, of course, themselves within the physical records are there. So I relied on those as well. I relied on, a whole series of records. I went to Louisiana, so the parish records, courthouse records, sale records. And one of the things when you talk about oral histories, some of the secondary sources, the priests writing about the family were really interesting because there was one of the priests who wrote about Louisa, talked about this old family story that they had, but also said that Louisa, always considered herself a slave of the Jesuits. She never considered herself a free person. And so you're reading that view, that's what he took away. And the obituaries described her as someone who always knew her place, right? At the same time, though, that we know that this history is going through, that she's telling, because there's I think it's her grandson who was interviewed in the 20th century who talks about slavery, and not a place that you would want to be. He talks about the horrors of it and how terrible it was. So she's navigating. So with sources, you're reading what you're reading, but you're always contextualizing. Another example of that is Moberly, who was a Jesuit brother at St. Inigo's, who was ousted by 1820 or so, in part because of the discontent of people there. And he describes just, what horrible, difficult, unruly people they are. And if you can read it that way, and he's saying these uncivilized, awful people, but you can also read what they're doing, which is kind of expanding as best they can their own autonomy, right? They're selling oysters, they're planting their own gardens, if an overseer or an enslaver is treating people badly, all of a sudden that person's horse is really, really tired because it's been ridden around all night long and stuff like that. So you could see kind of through that, again, not just a surface reading, but, what was happening and how people were trying to find a way to enlarge the space within which they had to live.
I just want to read one more passage from 272 that reinforces, Rachel, what you just said. This is about Gabriel Bennett, who was Louisa Mahoney's grandson. On his 100th birthday, the Community Times, a local newspaper, recorded Gabriel Bennett's thoughts on his family's time in bondage, describing what he must have learned from his grandmother, Louisa, who had helped care for him after his parents had died. Quote, "Slavery was really something. Some people suffered some awful lashes," he said. Quote, "It was a terrible period. There's just nothing like freedom."
Mm-hmm.
Let's take one more question. I think there's a question back there. Yeah.
From a writer's perspective, how many rewrites did you take this manuscript?
I think 4. Yeah, I think 4. I use Scrivener, which is a kind of a writing platform, and I think I have 4 drafts.
I'm going to tell this to my students when I think they get it right the first time. 4 drafts. On that note, I think I'm going to invite President DeGioia back to close our conversation.
Well, I want to begin by thanking Rachel and Adam for this beautiful conversation. It was an honor for all of us to be here and be witnesses to what we all saw this evening. It's been a privilege to have the opportunity to engage you in your work, and an honor to be able to celebrate this evening. I'd like to invite everyone to a book signing and a reception in Fisher Colloquium, which is located in this building on the 4th floor. And my colleagues will be able to point you in the right direction as you head out the doors in the back. I want to thank you all for being here and joining us this evening. Wish you all the very best for the rest of the evening.